Before the war, Dad was in high school. He graduated from grade 12, which back in the 1940s in Manitoba was the equivalent of first-year university. He was in Roland, Manitoba, and he was born in 1926. So in 1943, when he went to enlist, he was, of course, only 17. The recruiter, recognizing that he had a bit of a find, because he had some young lad who was ready, willing, and eager, and also had some training, asked if Dad's parents were on side with him joining. And the answer was yes. I don't think Grandma was probably as supportive as Grandpa was, because Grandpa had been in the infantry in the First World War, made it through Vimy Ridge. The recruiter looked at Dad and said, well, if that's the case, you need to be older. And here's how you get a birth certificate for the year of 1925. Dad did that, and the next week he was 18. So Dad joined the Royal Canadian Air Force. And they did all the training, and most of it would have been in Anson bombers, twin engine. The war, by this time, this would have been in 1944, they could see that it was starting to wind down as far as the Air Force was concerned. So they said that they would hang on to everybody, but they reported to radio operator gunnery school. Now, that was okay for my dad because Grandpa was the South Central Manitoba champion for trap and skeet shooting, and he taught my dad how to shoot. So Dad knew all about deflection shooting, leading your target, and whatnot. The course officer, who Dad refers to as the old man, but the guy might have been all of 25, was sitting there thinking to himself, Midwinter looks young. And at that point in time, they weren't supposed to send anybody who wasn't 18 overseas. So the course officer made the effort to make a long-distance phone call back to Dad's school in Roland. The pretext is we're checking on Allan Midwinter's background. One of the things they checked on was Dad's birth date, which, of course, was 1926. Dad's now caught. He gets called into the course officer's domain. Midwinter, are you lying sod? You're underage. Who, sir? Me, sir? No, sir, not I, sir. I have a birth certificate. I know you do, you sniveling snot. I called your high school and spoke to your principal. And for probably the only time in his life, my dad, almost speechless, came up with the snappy rejoinder of, oh. Dad, of course, was terribly upset at the time because the rest of his wireless air gunnery course were being assigned to operational squadrons and going overseas. And Dad said, the intervention of my course officer probably saved my life because about 80% of the course never made it home. The casualty rate amongst Bomber Command was exceedingly high. He was lucky. He survived. He was never deployed overseas, although he wanted to go, as did most young fellows of the day. So he went back to his civilian occupation, which was working with the telephone system, and he had that job after he graduated. Carmen was his main district. After his time in the Air Force, he went back to work for the telephone system as a lineman, and one of the locations he wound up working in Minnedosa. And his dad is up a pole. There's this good-looking young lady walking past, and Dad lets out a wolf whistle. And Bernice Vivian Braco became his spouse and my mom. Back in those days, there would have been general enthusiasm. At that point in the hostilities, casualty reports would have been coming back home, and it would have been mixed. There would have been support because he was going to help with the effort, but also some trepidation because there were a lot of folks who were going over who weren't coming home, and it would be very, very tough. I'm sure he knew families who had lost loved ones, and it was, I won't say an everyday thing, but it was not unusual to have somebody that you knew become a casualty, either dead or wounded. His views, war is a terrible waste. War is the absolute last thing you should have to resort to solve a problem. But that means that if you see things like Hitler on the ascendancy, heading towards becoming the most powerful man in the world, you need to stand up to those things beforehand. Yes, war is a terrible thing, but the way to avoid a war is to be prepared for one. And in my respectful view, the Western democracies, once the Berlin Wall came down and the Soviet Union collapsed on itself, have spent what the governments viewed as their peace dividend several times over, and now we are behind the eight ball. Production of even something relatively as simple as munitions, although they are terribly complicated things these days, our capability to produce them to provide our proxies, even like the Ukraine at this point in time, is woefully inadequate. But at some point in time, the velvet glove of diplomacy has to have an iron fist in it to flex the fingers.